So in our last video, we were talking about the differences and similarities between Penny and Primrose as our foil kind of characters. They're similar yet dissimilar. And another similar life event brings them back together again. After their mothers die, they decide to go on a holiday. And they, instead of going someplace exciting and new, they decide to go back to a place from their past that meant so much to them. They go back to the mansion that's now turned into this museum, this kind of monument of memory, as I like to call it, or an homage to the past that really highlights the war and this family and all of the things that happened so many years ago. However, we find out that there is no mention of the evacuees whose presence appeared to have been too brief to have left any trace. So there we have this kind of idea that there is that sense of lost childhood, or forgotten children. And in some ways, Penny and Primrose have been, left behind. They're not remembered, um, or certainly they go unacknowledged. And I don't know if they're not acknowledging that, this experience had a very real effect on hundreds of children, or not. I don't know. I think it's interesting, but. They meet again over this book, this idea of fantasy storytelling, and a book of Arthurian knights and his battle with the loathly worm. And we find out, as the caption reads, that tradition held that this worm infests the countryside. Its monstrous form could be segmented, like a worm, and reproduces, which is why it's so often seen. And I think that if you want to take it literally, that I think they saw something in the forest. But if you want to take that for what it is, this loathly worm could be a representation of all the bad crap that happens, the things that we experience that causes us to lose a little bit of our naivete, that is growing pains, so to speak, all of that, whether it's creation of our own or circumstances beyond our control, like war and death and all of those types of things. They happen at various stages all the time. So in some way or form or fashion, this worm appears whenever something bad happens. And I don't think it's an accident that Penny and Primrose have a reunion over this book, over this passage, because it sparks that conversation that they have to have. This reunion, a couple of interesting things happen while they're having this tea. And the first thing that happens is that they confirm that they both saw what they think they saw. It happened. And they've never talked about it to each other or anyone else since, until this very moment. And Penny, during this conversation, says that it finished me off. I guess seeing this thing in the forest finished her off. And in some ways, I wonder if that's her saying it kind of locks her into this fate or destiny that she can't quite escape. And similarly, Primrose. And because seeing this thing in the forest really shapes the trajectory, it shapes their lives. It changes the trajectory of their life completely. And whether it's because of what they saw in the forest, or just that experience in general of being forced to move away from home during the war, I don't know. But right after Penny says this, the more interesting thing that I think that happens is we get the mention of Alice for the first time since she went into the forest and never come. I mean, she goes into the forest. We don't hear about her again until this moment. And Primrose says it did finish her off, that little one. she got into its path. I wonder if I'd made her up. So in some ways, Alice to Primrose, Alice is not real. Alice is maybe like a version of herself or her psyche, the thing that she doesn't want to quite acknowledge. But Penny, who remembers her name, says her name was Alice, is very much real because the experiences for Primrose or Penny have to be. Um, so I think that this mention of Alice and this acknowledgement of what they have um, in the forest is something that they both find comfort in, and something that they're both kind of terrified about. And they make plans after they have this conversation. They make plans to go to dinner again, but neither one shows up. They stand each other up, and I think that that's, the question is, why don't they meet together again? And I think that the real answer, well, maybe an answer, is that in the grand scheme of things, these women, these adult women, have very little in common. The only thing that binds them together, that they've bonded over, is a childhood that is no longer, and this vision of what they saw in the forest. That is the only thing that keeps them glued together. And they've already had that conversation, so there's really nothing else for them to talk about. But I think at a deeper level, the reason that they don't see each other again is, I think that there is this dissatisfaction in the fact that the other saw it. So in some senses, it's finally real, and they can't or won't face each other because it's a reminder of something that they don't really want to face. So even though they don't have the desire to see each other again, they do have a desire to go back to the forest alone this time. And in their different visits to the forest, they have they have very different experiences while they're there. And um, Primrose, she has this very, I mean, I want to like sing with the birds when she's in this childlike idyllic vision of the forest. It's very Disney, isn't it? She's in a mossy throne at the center of the forest, and like a queen in the stories that she tells. And there's this magical fascination with animals that intertwine with her own childhood and her own kind of fascination with fantasy and the animals that her mother would make for her for Christmas. And in that kind of moment, we get the sense that Primrose, very much resents her mother and anybody in the adult world who takes her out of her fantasy. She doesn't want to be disillusioned. She wants to believe in Father Christmas. She wants to believe in the magic. And if you look on page 334, we find out that Primrose had never forgotten what they'd seen. But to her, this was a magic forest. And she had never frightened the little ones she entertained with tales of lost children in forest. The woods in her tales bred glamour. They were places where you used words like spangles and sequins. Primrose knew that glamour and the thing they had seen, brilliance and the ashen stink, came from the same place. She made both things safe for the little ones by restricting them to Pantomime Flats and sweet illustrations. So in some ways, this this story that she tells herself of what she saw in the forest, the stories that she tells the children, they're very much, they're to be protective. She doesn't want them to know about the dangers of the world, the scary things that the forest represents, the things that she doesn't want to acknowledge, um, all of the bad stuff that keeps them from being children. Um, so we get the sense from this description that she'd rather live in this world of fantasy of her choosing and her creation. And I wonder if that's a coping mechanism for Primrose. Like it's a way, it's what she can control. That idea of the lack of power that I was talking about earlier. As a child, she was powerless, and now, I mean, she couldn't control the war. She couldn't control being sent from home, death, all of those things that are beyond anyone's control. But now she has the agency as both a storyteller and a woman, to kind of create for her the life of fantasy for herself. And if we look at Penny on the other side of the coin, you like what I did there? On the flip side of the coin, she sees the forest as it really is. She sees the reality of what is there. So, for example, she finds the thread worms of knitting wool and unraveled dishcloth cotton, clinging newsprint. She found odd sausage-shaped tubes of membrane containing fragments of hair and bone and other inanimate stuff. Um, Quite suddenly, she came to a place with that she remembered, with large tree trunks that are thicker than she remembered, and all of these. She sees what's there. She doesn't have the same Disney experience that Primrose has, and it's her view, her perspective of the world and the forest is very much reflective of how she operates in her profession, even when she deals with children. Primrose tells them stories so they can be protected from the harsh truths of life, right? Penny, on the other hand, wants to be useful. She deals with these um, children with autism, these what's the word that they use, these troubled children, who have had traumas in their past, and rather than lie to them, she wants to be useful and help them deal with the reality. She wants to give them the coping skills that they need to live in the real world. And it's almost, we get this sense when she's in the forest, when she's having her experience, that she needs to see the thing again. She has to face it. She has to confront it. It has to be real for her. Otherwise, her entire life is false, is falsified. And she can't accept that. So they each have these different experiences of the forest, and they meet again at the train station, but they reject each other. And I think it goes back to that dissatisfaction that I was talking about earlier. And the reason why they don't want to see each other again, the reason why they reject each other, is because each forces the other to acknowledge what they can't accept. So, for example, for Primrose, Penny represents the truth, that what they saw was real, that all of the things, like her fantasy world crumbles when she looks at Penny. And for Penny, Primrose represents the fantasy, and it 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 she would crumble if what she saw wasn't real. It's got to be real, and Primrose brings up the idea that it may not be. So, I'm gonna make one more video. It'll be like 3 minutes long just because I'm running out of time. So hang tight.